Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am going to talk about the module Poverty and Public Services in Developing Countries from Population, Urbanization and Poverty. So students, we are going to discuss about the relationship between poverty and the access to basic services such as education, health, safe drinking water, and sanitation facilities. In today's world, it seems welfare is needed as it optimizes the wealth, and neglect of the welfare aspects may hinder the progress of generation of wealth. So this module aims to throw light on the prevalence of poverty in developing countries, the access to safe drinking water, the access to sanitation facilities, the access to education, and the access to health services. In developing countries, as the income increases, the demand for basic services is natural to increase. While we expect that as income of the citizens increases, the government's capacity to provide these resources would also increase, with increase in fiscal resources due to prosperity of the citizens. But the recent experiences of globalizing and urbanizing economies show that the rise in demand for public services is far greater than their supply, and the poor people suffer the most due to inadequacy in supply of public services. Let us have a quick look at the recent facts that would testify this argument. At least 80% of the population in the world lives on less than $10 a day. According to UNICEF, 22,000 children die each day due to poverty. Around 27 to 28% of all children in developing countries are estimated to be underweight or stunted. Based on enrollment data, about 72 million of children of primary school age in the developing world were not in school in 2005. Nearly a billion people who entered the 21st century are unable to read a book or sign their names. Infectious diseases continue to blight the lives of the poor across the world. Every year, there are 350 to 500 million cases of malaria with 1 million fatalities. Some 1.1 billion people in developing countries have inadequate access to water, and 2.6 billion lack basic sanitation. Almost 2 in 3 people lacking access to clean water survive on less than $2 a day, with 1 in 3 living on less than $1 a day. More than 660 million people without sanitation live on less than $2 a day, and more than 385 million on less than $1 a day. Access to piped water into the households averages about 85% for the wealthiest, 20% of the population, compared with 25% for the poorest 20%. For the 1.9 billion children from the developing world, there are 640 million without adequate shelter, that is 1 in 3. 1.6 billion people, a quarter of the humanity, live without electricity. All these facts clearly indicate the interconnection between poverty and inadequate access to public services in the developing countries. While in policy arena, the main focus had always remained growth, the objective of welfare and distribution never hold its deserving central position. The policymakers put forth the idea of distribution or the welfare of the masses only because neglecting this aspect may hamper the smooth path of the growth. Thus it seems that the welfare goals are derived in nature rather than direct ones. On the contrary, the theory states that wealth is needed because it optimizes welfare. Therefore, the developing economies work on the provision of public services only as a correcting mechanism. That is why the provision of these services always lag behind the growth of income, and since the developing economies are also characterized by inequalities, the availability of the services are further constrained for the poorer segments of the population. In this perspective, in the present module, the focus of our discussion would be to find the availability and access to public services by the poor and how far the farmer is helpful in alleviating the impacts of the latter in developing countries. Poverty rates in the developing countries. The world is lesser poor today than in 1990. Faster growth rates registered by the developing economies have helped them to reduce their poverty significantly, but still a significant proportion of the world's poor live in poverty or is vulnerable to poverty under the slightest of the shocks in the economy. Despite impressive progress in reducing poverty, in the past 3 decades, a substantial proportion of people in developing countries remain poor and are vulnerable to falling into deeper poverty when they are struck by negative shocks. According to the World Development Report 2014, more than 20% of the population in developing countries live on less than $1.25 a day. More than 50% on less than $2.5 and nearly 75% on less than $4 a day. Among the regions, it can be observed from the figure that South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest incidence of poverty among all other developing regions. Taking the developing regions as a whole, the proportion of people living on less than $1.25 a day fell from 47% in 1990 to 22% in 2010. About 700 million fewer people lived in conditions of extreme poverty in 2010 than in 1990. According to the MDG report 2013, extreme poverty rates have fallen in every developing region, with one country, China, leading the way. In China, extreme poverty dropped from 60% in 1990 to 16% in 2005 and 12% in 2010. The poverty remains widespread in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, although progress in the latter region has been substantial. In Southern Asia, poverty rates fell by an average of 1 percentage point annually, from 51% in 1990 to 30% 2 decades later. In contrast, the poverty rates in Sub-Saharan Africa fell only 8 percentage points over the same period. Despite this impressive achievement at the global level, 1.2 billion people are still living in extreme poverty. In Sub-Saharan Africa, almost half the population live on less than $1.25 a day. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only region that saw the number of people living in extreme poverty rise steadily from 290 million in 1990 to 414 million in 2010, accounting for more than a third of people worldwide who are destitute. The World Bank projects that by 2015, about 970 million people will still be living on less than $1.25 a day in countries classified as low or middle income in 1990. Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia will each be home to about 40% of the developing world population living in extreme poverty. If we include China, the MDG has been achieved by the developing world 5 years ahead of the target year 2050. But after excluding China, we can see that the developing world is still short of about 6 percentage points from the targeted level of poverty. The developing regions, which have achieved the target of halving the poverty levels of 1990 ahead of the schedule year, are Northern Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean, East Asia, which includes China only, and Southeast Asia. Thus, we have observed that the developing world is still home to a large number of poor. If we try to trace the incidence of poverty, many studies have shown that around the world, abject poverty is found in areas where poor health and lack of education deprive people of productive employment. Bad governance waste public resources and aggravate the sufferings of the poor, which means that the access to public services is very important for removal of poverty and inequality. The lack of public services may push people deeper into the poverty traps, as these people are highly dependent upon public services due to their lower capacity to purchase even the basic services at the market rates. Now let us discuss about the provision of public services. By definition, a public service is a service which is provided by the government to people living in its jurisdiction either directly or through financing the provision of the services provided by the private sector. These services may include a number of services, among which the most important are education, health, water and sanitation facilities, basic infrastructure such as electricity, housing, social protection, etc. Therefore, here we would discuss each of these services. Access to safe drinking water. Water is an essential service that all households, poor and rich, rural and urban, need on daily basis. Households lacking adequate water supply and sanitation face elevated health risks. Firms and micro-enterprises lacking electricity and water face higher costs of production. For reasons such as these, the inadequate provision of public services can compromise health, hinder economic growth, and hinder efforts to reduce poverty. A household is said to have adequate access to drinking water if water is delivered to the household through in-residence pipes or in-residence well, the latter accounting for a small proportion of cases. Households lacking such access draw their water from neighborhood sources, usually standpipes or wells. Water can also be purchased from vendors and tanker trucks. It can be taken from other sources such as from open streams and rainwater. But the quality of water from these sources is seriously questionable. The Millennium Development Goal 7 aims at ensuring environmental sustainability. An important target to achieve this goal is to halve the proportion of population without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. It is estimated that more than 2.1 billion people have gained access to improved drinking water sources since 1990, exceeding the Millennium Development Goal target. The UN data shows that the MDG drinking water target was met 5 years ahead of the schedule, despite significant population growth. Despite unprecedented progress, 768 million people still drew water from an unimproved source in 2011. 83% of the population without access to an improved drinking water source, that is 636 million, live in rural areas. Furthermore, concerns about the quality and safety of many improved drinking water sources still persists. As a result, the number of people without access to safe drinking water may be 2 to 3 times higher than official estimates. Most people around the world aspire to pipe drinking water supplies on their premises. Yet, 38% of the 6.2 billion people globally using an improved drinking water source do not enjoy the convenience and associated health and economic benefits of piped drinking water at home. Instead, they spend valuable time and energy queuing up at public water points and carrying heavy loads of water home, often meeting only minimal drinking water needs. The most affected are the poorest and the most marginalized people in society, many of whom, especially in urban areas, pay high prices for small amounts of often poor quality water. The availability of this public service in terms of quality of water differs across different income groups. Drinking water trends by wealth quintile show a strikingly different pattern. Data from South Asian countries show that major gains in coverage have been seen in all 5 quintiles. However, in the poorest quintile, improvements have been almost entirely in other improved category, namely wells and hand pumps. Piped water on premises is only used to a significant degree among households in 4th and 5th quintiles. Still, among the richest 20%, piped water is supplied to only 60% of households, and little improvement has been seen since 1995. Thus, although we have achieved the target of MDG 7C, yet the access to safe water according to the type and quality of water is not same for all the wealth quintiles. The poor who depend upon a well or a hand pump which is not situated within the premises of their households may have to bear huge cost in terms of money and time for collection of this safe water, the access to which is being claimed by the official data. In that case, even if the safe drinking water is available, it may not be benefiting the poor it should be. Access to sanitation facilities. The household's access to an adequate method of waste disposal is indicated by whether it uses a flush toilet. Alternatives include using a pit toilet or latrine and a variety of other methods of disposal such as throwaways and deposits in the bush. The households which lack the improved sanitation facility are vulnerable to health risks, as in absence of adequate sanitation facilities, they are exposed to great risks of communicable diseases. The poorer households in this way have to bear a huge cost, as recurrence of episodes of illness not only reduces their productive days, but it also has the long-term effect upon the productive capacity due to deterioration in health. Besides, they have to spend a significant proportion of their income for medical treatment. In this respect, the public services in shape of sanitation facilities and health facilities can be of utmost importance for poor segments of population. In this respect, the MDG has a target of halving the population without improved sanitation facilities by the year 2015. But the progress on provision of sanitation facilities had not been as satisfactory as in case of access to safe drinking water. From 1990 to 2011, 1.9 billion people gained access to a latrine, flush toilet, or other improved sanitation facilities. A strong push is needed to ensure that this number increases by another 1 billion people by 2015 to meet the MDG sanitation target. In 1990, just under half, that is 49%, of the global population had improved sanitation. Coverage must extend to 75% to meet the target, up from the current level of 64%. The region-wise improvements in terms of access to improved sanitation facilities is shown in Figure 5. The figure shows that the greatest progress has been made in Eastern Asia, where sanitation coverage increased from 27% in 1990 to 67% in 2011. This means that 626 million people gained access to improved sanitation facilities over 21 years. Sub-Saharan Africa and Oceania remain farthest behind. Between 1990 and 2011, over 240,000 people on average per day gained access to an improved sanitation facility. Many were born into a family that already have a toilet, while others were connected to a sewer network or finished the construction of a latrine for the first time in their lives. Despite these accomplishments, more rapid progress is needed. Meeting the MDG target will mean extending sanitation services to an average of 660,000 people a day, every day between 2011 and 2015. Again, these achievements are highly unequal across different income groups. The poorest 40% of the population in South Asia has barely benefited from improvements in sanitation. The availability of additional data for some countries in Southern Asia enables us not only to examine sanitation use according to wealth quintiles, but also to look at trends over time. Such an analysis was undertaken for the period 1995 to 2008 for 3 countries in Southern Asia, which represent 82% of the region's population. It shows that improvements in sanitation are strongly correlated with wealth and that the richest households have benefited disproportionately. The trend data also show that sanitation coverage in the 2 poorest quintiles has shown little change over the 13-year period. 4 out of 5 people in these 2 quintiles practice open defecation. The most progress was seen in the 4th wealthiest quintile, while the richest 5th of the population has maintained its very high coverage. Let us discuss about access to education. Education is not only a fundamental right, but also one of the most basic ways people can achieve their well-being. It increases lifetime earnings as well as how much a person can engage with and contribute to society. Better educated individuals tend to be healthier and to live longer. A workforce with the right skills is critical to the success of an economy. Investing in education brings individuals and societies enormous benefits socially, environmentally, and economically. To realize these benefits, children and adolescents must have access to education, starting with pre-primary education. The MDG 2 aims at achieving universal primary education by 2015 in every part of the world. However, in 2011, 57 million children of primary school age were out of school, down from 102 million in 2000. Further, 123 million youth, that is those aged between 15 to 24 years, lack basic reading and writing skills. It is estimated that although the world had progressed tremendously in achieving the goal of universalization of primary education, but the progress has slowed considerably. Between 2008 and 2011, the number of out-of-school children of primary school age fell by only 3 million. This means that at the current rate, the world is unlikely to meet the target of universal primary education by 2015. We can observe the progress of enrollment rate in primary education from the Millennium Development Goals Report 2013 by UN. The report shows that developing regions have made impressive strides in expanding access to primary education, with the adjusted net enrollment rate growing from 83% in 2000 to 90% in 2011. Over the same period, the number of children out of school worldwide declined by almost half, from 102 million to 57 million. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to more than half the world's out-of-school children. Between 2000 and 2011, the adjusted primary net enrollment rate increased from 60% to 77%. However, the region continues to face a rising demand for education from a growing population. In 2011, 32 million more children were of primary school age than in 2000. Considerable progress has also been made in Southern Asia, where the adjusted enrollment rate of children of primary school age increased from 78% to 93% between 2000 and 2011. Almost half the reduction in the global number of children out of school can be attributed to this region, where the number of such children fell from a high of 38 million in 2000 to 12 million in 2011. It is also being recognized that household poverty is the single most important factor keeping children out of school. This is one of the findings of an analysis of data collected through household surveys in 63 developing countries between 2005 and 2011. Children and adolescents from the poorest households are at least 3 times as likely to be out of school as their richest counterparts. The figure also shows the widening gap among the girls and boys as income of the households fall. This points towards the need of provision of subsidized public services for educational attainment for the poorest households. Improvements have also been made in case of secondary and tertiary education. The progress in tertiary education in developing economies, Asia and Pacific, Africa and Latin America and Caribbean is much slower than in secondary education. Thus, the developing economies need more of the public services to achieve higher levels of education set by the developed economies. The differences in educational attainments are mainly explained by the differences in the resources devoted to education. The resources that societies invest in education foster economic growth, enhance productivity, contribute to personal and social development, and reduce social inequality. In order to reach the education for all goals and meet Millennium Development Goal 2 on achieving universal primary education, it is necessary to have adequate financing for education. While education is financed from both public and private sources, the majority of the financing in most of the countries is allocated from total government budget. Since developing economies have fewer fiscal resources, their expenditure on education is relatively low. Due to limited resources, their emphasis is more upon primary education, and the secondary and tertiary education is given relatively less importance. This leads to accentuation in inequalities in educational attainments at the secondary and tertiary levels. Public expenditure on education as a share of GDP measures how significant government spending on education is in relation to the total output of the economy. In 2008, the Oslo Declaration urged governments to spend the equivalent of 4% to 6% of gross national product on education. However, in Asian region, where the education status is lower than rest of the regions except Africa, the expenditure on education is hardly 3.5% of region's GDP, though there are many intra-regional variations. This low proportion of the GDP spent on education shows that many of the countries in the region have not even achieved the minimum level of 4% of GDP as mandated by Oslo Declaration. This low level of expenditure on education leads to inadequate and poor quality public services providing education, leading to unsatisfactory outcomes of educational status. Access to health services. Investments in providing health services are often seen as vital to achieving sustainable and inclusive development. However, many developing economies may lack resources to do the same. With the Asian and Pacific region acting as the engine of global economic growth, it might be expected that more resources would be directed to health. But in reality, many countries exhibit low levels of health spending and limited coverage of health workers in Asia as well as other developing economies. Consequently, people in poor countries tend to have less access to health services than those in better off countries, and within each of the economy, the poor have lesser access to medical services than the richer ones. The WHO report shows that the health services increase as the income increases. This can be observed from figure 7. The figure shows that the access to health services measured as number of physicians, nurses, and hospital beds per thousand of population increases with the per capita income levels of the countries. This shows that poor countries have poorer access to health services. Actually, the government of these countries also spend lower amount on health services, not only as percentage of their GDP, but also as percentage of government expenditure. During 2010, total expenditure on health as percentage of GDP was about 12% in high-income countries as compared to merely 5% for low-income countries. In high-income countries, the governments contribute about 62% of total health expenditure as compared to merely 39% in low-income countries. As a result, the private expenditure is lower in the former as compared to the latter. Further, per capita expenditure on health by governments in high-income countries is also higher than that of the low-income countries. Consequently, the poor in these economies have lower access to health services, and the neediest one have lower access to health services in each type of the disease. So students, let us summarize what we have learned from this module. To sum up, it can be stated that poverty of the individuals and that of the nations is closely associated with access to public services. As the incidence of poverty increases, or say the level of income falls, the access to education, health, and other basic amenities such as water, sanitation, etc. falls. And the poorest are the worst sufferers. Moreover, there is a circular relationship between the access to these services and incidence of poverty. Inadequate access also leads to inadequacies in productive capacity, resulting in lower earnings of the individuals. Therefore, it is advised that any policy targeting at the alleviation of poverty must focus on provision of these services for inclusive and equitable growth. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.